Right. Well, hey, y'all, this is Gray Crawford, and welcome to my first interview on my astrology channel. I'm very honored and excited to have Rosie Finn here, who has a very exciting new book out, Persephone's Revolution. It's published by Revelor Press. We'll put links into how to purchase that and go a lot more into detail about this. But welcome, Rosie. It's very excited to have you here.
Thanks, Gray. I'm excited to be your first person interviewed.
Yeah, so you are my first ever astrology teacher. I don't know if you know that you're actually the first even real professional, fully working and practicing astrologer I had actually ever even met because I had been studying just on my own through books, and I knew people that were into astrology, but not actually somebody that was actually practicing.
Hmm.
And I had my first actually astrology reading with you as well. So yeah, I've been wanting to have you be like the first guest that I do as an interview on my channel, and been thinking about that for I think even like a couple of years almost at this point. I've been waiting for your book to come out because I knew you would have this book coming out, and I really liked the idea of honoring you as being my first guest. And I'm also excited just to talk about your book because I was also really waiting for your book to come out to talk about a lot of these ideas and be able to reference your book. And because your ideas in this book related to Pluto and mundane astrology are very powerful, very thorough with the research, and they significantly reframe the way we can talk about all of the transits going on this year and next year. So, yeah, congratulations on all the work you put into your book.
Thank you, Gray. I think you've been with me as I've been working on it for 20 years, I think. And,
Yeah,
uh,
I was trying to
yeah,
think the first time I heard you, how early were you starting to talk about this time period? I mean, I feel like you have been talking about this time period for like 20 years.
yeah, I think I started doing the research around 2001, 2002. And I think I really started talking about in 2004. And yeah, I thought I'd have it out back then. And I felt because my knowledge of history was pretty weak back then. I think it's pretty strong now, but I felt like I needed to do really deep research to make sure that what I was seeing was actually accurate because it was pretty mind-blowing back then, in particular, to think about the kind of changes that were coming. Now that we're here, it's a little easier to see how big the changes are that are upon us. But I remember freaking people out when I started talking about it 20 years ago because it was so beyond what people could imagine back then. But I was looking
Right.
at this pattern, and it's a pattern, but it's also an evolution and it's a changing pattern, which also uh, had me questioning even the astronomy. It took me about 3 years of studying the astronomy, and now I'm going to be able to explain it to you in 5 minutes. But the fact that I spent 3 years making sure that I was understanding the astronomy correctly, that was part of it also.
Yeah, and the long process of historical research that you conducted, which, could have turned it into a I don't know, probably a 20 volume book potentially. But the fact that you spent so long researching it and thinking about it, I think it really shows in the book that it's very impressive that you're able to condense these big historical narratives down into a pretty concise, very concise. Actually, you cover, I mean, a huge period of time in the book, which we can talk about. But you're able because you've thought about it for so long and been working on it. It does really show in the book.
Thanks, Gray. It did. I think that was a couple of years just distilling and pulling it into one book. And it was a question mark of whether it should be different ones, but I wanted it to be all together so people could actually see the pattern and not question it because I think sometimes, well, one, because astrologers don't have this massive amount of money for grants and for research, so they don't have the time to just kind of dive into the research that's necessary. So a lot of times people cherry pick and then they We'll only look, let's say, 500 years back and think that's a long time to look. But when you're looking at a Pluto cycle, that's only 2 cycles. That's not enough information.
Yeah, and how far back do you go in the book?
We go back to 1800 BC,
Hmm.
which that's really kind of around the first times that we're working with history in a way that I could get dates for things.
Right.
So if we go past that, I mean, archaeologists in the last 20 years have been able to ascertain more dates. But even 20 years ago, I wasn't able to get dates for events happening prior to 1800 BC.
Mm.
So that's the time of Hammurabi, and that we have these tablets and we have these stones that we can determine what was happening then.
Right. So I guess before going a little bit further and just to make sure people know who you are, so you and I live in Olympia, which is the state capital of the state of Washington. It's the land of the Squally, Squaxin, people of the water. You're very well known in this area, but just for people that don't know who you are, just anything you could do just to introduce who you are in your work.
Well, I've been an astrologer since 1996, and yeah, I moved here in 95. And my background is actually before that was in engineering, so I was a
Mm.
scientist, and I lived in an ashram and studied psychology a bit. So when I started doing astrology, that everything kind of fit together for me. And for many years, I've been really focused on building community in Olympia. So, together with Carol Trusado, who is an herbalist who passed away recently, she and I both had this value of being community supported herbalist and astrologer. And that was a value I had. I've been reaching out over the last couple of years to broaden my horizons, in part because I do want people to have hope for the future. And I want people to, I think the research that I've done brings a sense of perspective and possibility that I feel like people need to hear right now. And so I'm wanting this to go out and not just be my local supported astrologer.
Yeah, and that was a really beautiful community that you and Carol held for so many years. I feel very fortunate that that's really how I learned astrology, especially in terms of transits and just thinking about the coming transits, you sharing about the transits, and then Carol going into herbs and different ways that plant medicine would also line up with whatever astrology was going on. It was a great experience to be part of that.
Mm.
So yeah, exactly what you were just saying about this idea of hope, that is one of the things that is very powerful about your book, which simultaneously acknowledges chaos and the fact that we are entering a chaotic time. But there is a very important message that your book is also showing, actually very classic thought of what does emerge from chaos, and that there is something more hopeful than we may expect or even be able to conceive of right now that could ultimately emerge from this time period, because your book is also looking at this much longer span of time and putting things in a context of many centuries of story arcs essentially. Yeah, so how would you describe like one of the main messages that you've really found with your book?
Well, what the book is looking at is the cycle of Pluto as it goes above and below the equatorial plane, which is called declination. And I focus on when Pluto goes out of bounds, which is when Pluto goes above the equatorial plane past 23.5 degrees. So there's Pluto going north above and Pluto going south above. And Pluto goes goes out of bounds, and it has been going out of bounds twice in every cycle. And it's been going out of bounds for shorter and shorter periods of time because the equatorial plane in relationship to the orbital plane is changing. So this is that the tilt of the Earth is we're on a wobble, and that wobble is changing our perspective. And as it's changing our perspective, it's shifting so that Pluto doesn't appear to go beyond 23 and a half degrees in the next cycle, and that the time period coming up between 2025 and 2035 is the last time that Pluto is going out of bounds. And there are extraordinary events that happen in the world when Pluto goes out of bounds. When it goes out of bounds north, there's one theme of empires building. And when it goes out of bounds south, is the end of empires, or there's revolution, or there's systems collapse. But there's also uh, more of an awakenings that can happen when Pluto goes out of bounds to the south also. So there's two things. One, Pluto going out of bounds to the south is really different than Pluto out of bounds to the north. And then this is the last time. And both of these things, I think, bring a lot of hope. So
When
in, yeah, go ahead.
when you mentioned about, and we'll talk a little bit more here in a second about declination and out of balance so people can really understand that. But when you just mentioned the Earth's axis tilting, is that similar to the idea some people are aware of how we've had a shift of like certain constellations rising on the horizon at equinox or solstice points, or the North Star changing over time, how it used to be the star in Draco the dragon. Now we're actually in a really unique time of Polaris coming. Is that a
Yeah,
similar thing the way that's going?
it's exactly the same. The thing
Hmm.
that is bringing this shift is, or let's say correlating with this shift, is the same thing that correlates with the Aquarian age, which has to do with the tilt of the Earth, and then the work that people have done with the Mayan calendar and down in the ruins of Mexico, where they've seen that the winter solstice sun rising is now in alignment with the galactic center.
Right.
This all has to do with the Earth's tilt changing. Even our perspective on the galactic center, that the Earth's tilt and therefore our equatorial plane, which is the equator extended out into space, which orients us to space on this planet, that our orientation to space is moving more into alignment with the galactic center and really
Hmm.
with our galaxy.
Hmm.
So, yes, all of these shifts are related to the same thing. And yet it's all perspective. And if we understand that perspective creates reality, then it's not just, some superficial alignment that's happening, but is our whole way of perceiving the stars and our mythology in connection to the stars.
And that's a far out idea. You just mentioned that even myself knowing that, it's still something I can think about a lot, and it's pretty mind blowing. And then I know some people listening may not even fully realize that, but there is something about that galactic center, which is like the galactic center of everything, that
Mhm,
our solstice is aligning with over time. And that was part of the Mayan calendar, things that
mhm,
people have been talking about. And that is also that lining up that we're coming into also happens to coincide with the fact that the Pluto orbital plane related to us
mhm.
is becoming less extreme. Is that pretty accurate to say?
Yeah. And I'll add in this piece is that if you look at the Kuiper belt and all the objects in the Kuiper belt, there's a general tendency for them to be elongated in the same direction.
Mm.
And so it's not even just Pluto, even though some of the other major orbs in the Kuiper belt are so extreme that they're still going out of bounds. But there is a general shift in our perspective of the entire Kuiper belt that's happening
Which
because
is kind of the far out primordial
Mhm.
aspects of our system, right? So there is an interesting like lining up with the center in some way, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so when we're talking about so just talk about declination for a moment so people understand before we go further about out of bounds. Declination is very important in astrology. Some people like you, I know, have always been into it, and there's lots of astrologers out there that are. I feel what's popular in astrology right now is a complete lack of awareness of declination. I don't, most people that are very popular, people in astrology almost never even mention declination. So this is different than a planet moving through just a zodiac sign. Like as we're talking right now, Venus is in Pisces, Mars is retrograde in Cancer. But declination shows in one way it's related to visually and how like you're saying that it can be north or south if we project out our the equator of our planet like projected out into space essentially does something is something lining up with that intersection with the ecliptic, or is it north or south? Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if we think about the planets moving around through the signs of the zodiac or through the constellations, depending on whether you're tropical or sidereal,
All
but
right, so yeah, that's true. Venus would be in Aquarius in a sidereal.
yeah, we could think of that in a way as one set of coordinates, and then north and south as it moves up and down is another set of coordinates, and potentially equally as important.
And so one thing about that is when I think a good way to often think about is just the equinoxes and solstices. So when the sun gets to tropical zero Aries, it's at that intersection point of our equator and the ecliptic, and we have equal day and night everywhere around the Earth. And then it's then from the northern hemisphere perspective, it's the sun's then rising to its greatest height at the summer solstice, which is at 23.5 degree zone. In the northern hemisphere, we have the longest day then, and then we have decreasing light. The sun comes down, and in declination, it goes to zero Libra tropically at the fall equinox in the northern hemisphere, equal day, equal light again. It then goes down to like the nadir or the bottom point at the winter solstice. Again, it's at 23.5 degree zone, darkest time of the year. And so this band of where the sun gets to its greatest height and greatest depth related to that, which is very fundamental to our experience of life. It's what to me I definitely am into the sidereal zodiac. I know you practice with the sidereal zodiac yourself, but that's to me it's always so powerful about the tropical zodiac is just how it lines up with that. But what would you, so essentially, if a planet is staying within that 23.5 degree north or south, that means it's within bound. Is that right?
Correct.
And what
Yeah.
does it mean for a planet to be within bounds versus if it somehow gets out of that range? Yeah.
Well, I think like you're saying, it's such a profound experience for us to have seasons and to watch the sun rise and set in different places, and that within our experience, which is mostly focused on the earth and sun, right? A lot of people tune into the moon, but let's face it, we all tune into the sun. And within that experience, it keeps us in the bounds of our normalcy or of our
Mm.
typical everyday life experience. So beyond 23.5 degrees is beyond where our perspective normally goes, beyond where the sun, where the earth and the sun relate to each other. And that's our main focus of relating. And mostly, I want to say that a lot of astrologers have looked at other planets out of bounds. Venus goes out of bounds, Mars goes out of bounds, Mercury goes out of bounds. And what they've noticed is that when that planet goes out of bounds beyond 23.5 degrees, it gets to do its worst, or not always its worst, but it gets to be its wild side. It gets to do whatever it's here to do. Like Venus, Venus's worst is to get us to fall in love and to get us to create great works of art, and it's like super inspiring. Uh, it's when Van Gogh did his greatest works of art when Pluto was out of bounds. Um, Newton and Maxwell and Einstein, they all had massive, extraordinary periods when Mercury was out of bounds. So the brilliant ideas happen at those time periods. Mars out of bounds is when there's more explosive energy.
I mean, right now, Mars is not only retrograde, but is going out of bounds also, even as you and I are talking right now.
Okay, so yeah, more violence, more explosive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, the gaseous giants, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus, these planets, because they're so tight inside the orbital plane, they don't go out of bounds. So then we jump to Pluto, and Pluto used to go out of bounds for very long time periods. But because of our orientation changing, it's only going out of bounds for 10 years. In the past, it was even longer, 20-year time periods. And now it's 10 years. And so Pluto is this planet of power and evolution and profound and deep changes. And it's the first planet we detected inside the Kuiper Belt, right? So it's the planet that taps us into the deep work of that cloud out there. And it's about how humanity needs to evolve, the lessons, the deeper lessons that we're learning as a collective of a species. Maybe you've got more to say about Pluto. But when Pluto, the thing about the next time is that when Pluto goes out of bounds, it's not even out of bounds for the entire year. So it's only going out of bounds. It's like tapping out of bounds from August through December for the next 10 years. So we're not even in a total extreme time period the entire time. Like we're going to be pulsating for 10 years.
So in the past, it would go out of bounds for most of the entire year, even
Yeah, it
what
would
people
just
would
stay
experience.
there. Even yeah, even the last time it was out of bounds, 1938 to 1940, I think it was just,
Yeah.
and I actually did all the calculations. I realized it was a little bit longer than I thought. But till the early 1950s.
Yeah, I think I noticed, I think it goes up to like 52 or something. So I thought that was interesting. The tail end of it actually lined up pretty near when the Saturn Neptune conjunction a couple times ago came in, which was like more like 52, 53. So I do think it did stretch into that early 50s period. I remember seeing that in your book. So, I mean, you can look while you're looking at that. So, one thing, just what you're saying is that's really interesting is, right now Mars is going out of bounds. We get Venus and Mercury have been recently out of bounds. Fascinating for the book coming out. I actually think this is a really meaningful synchronicity is that the lunar nodes are at zero Aries right now in Libra, so we're actually in a lunar standstill where the moon goes extremely out of bounds. So we're having that happen this week
Hmm.
as we're talking. But then I think Saturn does not go out of bounds, right? Which is really interesting just about the meaning of Saturn and keeping us sort of bound within. But Pluto goes extremely out of bounds and has since at least 1800 BC, but over time it's gotten shorter and shorter. So the last time Pluto was out of bounds was, is it like 1942? It's a 40s essentially, right? 1944,
38. It's
1930. Okay, so it goes as far back to 38. Okay.
almost exactly at Kristallnacht, almost exactly at the night of broken glass
Okay.
when things were really heating up.
But was it more extremely out of bounds like in 42, 43,
44 and 45 were
44, 45 extreme? Yeah. So, but essentially World War II, the
and
lead
the
into World.
most extreme was when the atom bombs were dropped. So it was the summer times of 44 and 45. Yeah.
So, what's really interesting about that, while we're on this topic of declination, is that's also the time period when, not when they were dropped, but when Oppenheimer did his test in the desert. When I was looking at declination cycle of Neptune, because Neptune's coming to zero Aries, which means the next couple of years Neptune's doing not extreme, but Neptune's coming up to be on that zero declination point, which is
Mhm.
one of your phases we'll talk about in a moment related to Pluto. But the last time Neptune was there in Libra, it wasn't zero, but it had been going back and forth. But the last time Neptune was as close to that point as it's going to be was essentially when Oppenheimer did that test. And so Neptune since then has kind of come all the way around to come back up again. And there's actually an interesting link with the Neptune cycle we might get into related to this topic that you're speaking about here. But essentially, World War II and the extreme devastation of World War II was the last time Pluto was out of bounds. And this is something a lot of astrologers are bringing up because of Uranus being in Gemini then. But the thing that's really one of the key points about your book was that experience of World War II is in fact the antithesis or the opposite of what we are going to be experiencing this time around with Uranus and Gemini. And so that extreme devastation of World War II goes with you call it the power phase. Is that right?
Yeah, so Pluto out of bounds to the north is very different than what happens Pluto out of bounds to the south. So if you're
Mm-hmm.
just looking at Pluto out of bounds, you kind of miss this nuance.
Mm-hmm.
So Pluto out of bounds to the north is the building of empire. It's the power time. It's when great dictators and conquerors take over and expand their empires. And there's massive devastation and war every single time. Now, if you study history enough, you're like, there's always war going on. But the massive big wars really occur in that power time. We have Genghis Khan as an example. He really almost stepped into power. His wife was abducted, and he went in and got his wife back and then just started this rampage just as Pluto was going out of bounds. He was crowned Genghis Khan, conqueror, emperor, when Pluto is at its most extreme of declination. And then he died a few years after Pluto left out of bounds. So he's one kind of example of the perfect arc. Again, to the north during the power time. Augustus Caesar is another example. Um, so those are ones that people have mostly heard of. When
Augustus Caesar was a power out of bounds north,
out of bounds to the north,
which is
yeah.
we're not experiencing now. And the thing that I think we might have mentioned this already, just to reemphasize, one of the things you found in your book is we are not going to actually experience that again for how many thousands of years?
As far as I could tell, at least the next 3 to 5,000 years. I
At
mean,
least,
it's a
yeah.
cycle, a 26,000 year cycle. It will come back again, but
Hmm.
I couldn't find, exactly when it comes back, and it's thousands of years from now. So, um,
So,
yeah, and we'll be in a totally different world by then.
right.
Uh, so then Pluto out of bounds to the south is is a rebalancing, a rectification of the abuses that happen when Pluto's out of bounds to the north. So it's a time more of revolution, of uprisings, of leaders coming in who create reforms. We see leaders come in who see that people are rising up and they have to change their ways and put in infrastructure or develop things that support people versus just conquering for the sake of conquering.
Mm.
So
And
that's what we're headed into.
right. And something with that is we'll talk a moment here about there's different phases of this. Um, but one of the things that your book also points out is a lot of times previous attempts at reform and revolution and change and protest and social justice movements, they often don't fully work out or they get crushed when this is attempted at other phases. But it tends to be when those actually stick and something happens or an extreme empire make some more helpful reforms
Hmm.
tends to actually stick and actually happen in this reform period that we're entering. Is that right also?
Yes. Yeah, we see a lot in between from in between the power to reform time. So we're moving into reform time. In between that time period, we see a lot of people who are activists shouting, the emperor has no clothes. They're trying to get people to wake up. They're not entirely successful until we get to the reform time, which is really kind of the time of the 100th monkey.
Hmm.
There's and so so many people get executed or die. When we think about the last 2,000 years, we're talking about a very strong Judeo-Christian model, and so we're looking at martyrs and things and people um, getting executed
Hmm.
during the time period. So yeah, they're not successful, but then we see the success. To use an example of the Roman Empire, when Pluto is out of bounds to the north, as soon as Pluto moves out of bounds to the north, Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon. He starts this empire building from a republic. By the time it's at the peak of out of bound, Augustus Caesar has come into power. He's crowned. He continues to expand the empire until Pluto leaves out of bounds. And then when it leaves out of bounds, he starts focusing more on infrastructure. Then there's a period in between that power time before Pluto goes out of bounds to the north, which is the time period when Jesus lived. And Jesus was one of those examples of somebody who was creating an uprising, but he was killed. And we see Mani was killed. There's lots of Savonarola was killed. They all like lived and taught in that same time period. And yet their followers were successful, and particularly at the Reform time, which is the time of Peter and Paul, and them getting the word out. So that's when the Gospels were written. So the word of Jesus, so he's teaching and talking about it earlier, like, say, related to Martin Luther King time or the demonstrations and protests that we've had, even the Occupy movement, all of those kind of happening, sort of correlating with the time of Jesus. So what we're heading into now is really the massive following that is correlating to the big civil rights movements and to any of the big teachers. And since this is the last time period, I think this is going to be different. We're in a very different world than any of the other cycles. And I think this could be a really global consciousness shift that happens that's coming. And it's coming in response to uh, what happened in World War II. So, yeah, people are talking about World War II, and that's not a bad thing to be doing because it's bringing our awareness to that possibility, which is exactly what needs to happen right now. We need to see that, oh, this could happen again so that we make sure it doesn't. And we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. Now, what do we have to take down in the process? How difficult of a process that is? That'll a little bit depend on where you live, what country you live in,
Right.
um, your own personal consciousness and awareness.
Right. And so that is one of the really important points that your book makes, which is also something that takes us into this territory even more of the unknown and this sort of unprecedented period of time we're entering right now, is that you've seen this pattern with Pluto out of bounds repeat. Um, and this is the last time it's going to happen for 3 to 5 thousand years. And it's ending fittingly with the reform, which is countering the time of World War II or Genghis Khan. I mean, another example used in your book with Genghis Khan being the power. You contrasted that with his grandson Kublai Khan.
Mhm.
Is there anything thing you could say about
Yeah.
that example as another one for reform before we go on a little bit more contrasting that with because you mentioned Genghis Khan already?
Yeah, that's good. So yeah, during the reform time of the cycle where Genghis Khan was, his grandson Kublai Khan came in. He tried to take things over, but he wasn't successful. And eventually, during when Pluto went out of bounds to the south, he started changing his ways and focusing on infrastructure and focusing on welfare of the people. This is where Marco Polo went to visit him when Pluto was out of bounds and was like, wow, they're doing really cool things over there. And he brought that over to Europe. That's because Kublai Khan, even though he might have tried, he wasn't able to succeed. And he put the empire into debt. And that's why the Mongolian Empire didn't last. But he was all about creating a more enlightened society in China at the time.
Hmm. And so, yeah, and that's one of the things you brought up is there are some different reform examples like that of leaders sort of changing policies, like Justinian, who was also not this really a benevolent emperor, really. I mean, just like amassing huge territory, but there's like the innocent till proven guilty. That sort of law comes in during also reform, right? Pluto out of bounds south, like we're entering now. So it's not like you can just look at everything's just great in these out of bounds south periods like we're entering, but there's you noticing an overall tendency compared to the extremes, the other side of Pluto when it's out of bounds north, like World War II. There's this sort of pattern of tendency towards reforms and doing something different, and protests actually sticking and change actually coming in more.
Mhm.
So you have four phases that you talk about. So we're already talking about Pluto going extremely out of bounds far north or extremely out of bounds far south. There's also the phenomenon of Pluto coming up to cross over basically the point of the projecting the equator out into space, which I think we think all about a lot being usually planets being around zero Aries or Libra, but I don't think that's necessarily the case with Pluto because it's such a odd orbit. I think people can probably guess already that Pluto out of bounds north tends to be Pluto in Leo, and Pluto out of bounds south, the reform that we're talking about, is tends to be Pluto in Aquarius. Is
Well,
that
it
right?
shifted over time. So it was
Mm-hmm.
Pluto out of bounds. North was Cancer. It's been shifting from Cancer into Leo.
Cancer to Leo. Mm-hmm.
Reform has been moving from Capricorn to Aquarius.
Mm.
And Pluto, when it's at 0 degrees declination, right now is around 9 degrees Taurus, and that was in
Okay.
the 1860s. And then the other time it crossed the equatorial plane, going from north to south, was in the 1980s. And that was Pluto was in Scorpio.
That was in Scorpio. So, and was that probably in the past Aries Libra, if you go further back in time, I guess. So, those intersections. So basically, as if people want to think about this more as a diachly movement, if they're used to it, but more recently, it's been that movement of Pluto going through Taurus, where it's coming up from being at the furthest point, and it's now rising to cross our equator, which a lot of times when you were talking about how planets are up at the top or going beyond, or they're more unrestrained and more extreme and sort of more freedom oriented, unbounded. I guess is the best way to describe it. A lot of people, do you agree? A lot of astrologers talk about how planets and there's also a powerful force when the planet crosses the hits that equator point. Is there how do you normally describe that?
Uh, what I've noticed when Pluto goes out of when Pluto's declination is shifting from south to north, and of course this is all relative, right? We could have had the whole globe shift upside down, But so when it does that is a time of great visionaries.
Mm-hmm.
And the visionaries begin the cycle. So the cycle essentially takes 248 years. And the beginning point are people who come up with a new idea and they're introducing something brand new into the consciousness of humanity. And usually it's being taught at a university or being taught to the elite. It's not something that the general public has access to. And throughout the cycle, that idea grows and expands until when it gets to the reform time, that's when people have access to it. So it begins with the visionary time period. Like we can even look at that to go back to the Roman Empire time. The visionary of that time period was Cicero. And he was really this great orator who was looking at the direction of the Roman Empire and the expansion of it. He was in the military at the time, and looking at the laws that would later come into play in that cycle. And even when we look at the Christian movement that was arising at the time, the Christian movement was a reaction to the autocracy of the Roman Empire. It was a reaction to kind of religious dogmatic control that was happening then. And it was a religion, or at the time period, a movement really of people saying, it's okay to, like, we can all be religious, we can all be spiritual. You don't have to be born into a certain caste or be born into a certain tribe. We all have access to spirituality, and that was kind of the main, at least political shift that was happening. So Cicero was talking about that at the beginning of the cycle. He was that visionary.
Mm,
Um, so in our current cycle, the 1860s, there's a lot of visionaries to choose from. There's all the writers, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Karl Marx was writing. He wrote Das Kapital in that time period. And there was a lot of scientists. Darwin had written his Origin of Species in 1859, right? Is that Thoreau had just finished his book on Walden. And the main one that I like to hook into is James Clerk Maxwell, because
hmm
he wrote the equations for electricity and magnetism,
hmm
for which all of our technology has been developed based on. And without those equations, there would have been no computers, no technology. And so sometimes in this arc, at the vision time period, uh, what comes into play in the power time period are massive inventions. Like we have, so in the power time period of our cycle was Turing and Oppenheimer, and it was developing computers and developing atomic energy, nuclear energy, and there's kind of an explosiveness about it in that time period. If we go uh, back to, and I know we want to cover the Renaissance Reformation cycle, so let's cover that. The visionary, then that cycle began in the 1370s,
hmm
and Petrarch, Boccaccio, these were the great philosophers of the Italian Renaissance time. But John Wycliffe was a professor, I forget whether it was Cambridge or Oxford, but he was in England, and he started talking about the corruption in the Catholic Church at that time period. And the Catholic Church at this time period was kind of a powerful, it had its influence in all the kings and wars and everything that was happening. It was post-Crusade time, 1370s. It was post-plague. Plague happened in the 1340s. And now there was uh, Wycliffe, who was teaching Chaucer. Chaucer was going to school with him. And then we have these writings that are looking at corruption, but not getting out. When we get to the power time, that's when Gutenberg invents the printing press. And so the literacy rates went from 10% literacy to almost 90% literacy within a century time period after post printing press. So the printing press is like the computers of today. It was invented in the same exact time in the cycle, and it created a different culture around literacy, what people could understand. When we got to the second time Pluto goes to 0 degrees declination, but this time going from north to south, I call that the justice time period. It's I get that it's not a perfect name because we don't have justice. It never happens, occasionally, but it's the cry for justice. It's
Hmm.
people having a major outcry. There's an underground movements, grassroots movements grow. And at
Hmm.
that time in that cycle, Savonarola was a preacher in Florence who started really creating a big voice. It was right after Lorenzo de' Medici died. He dies, and Savonarola kind of steps into power in Florence. He gets killed, just like Jesus, just like Mani. Um, but his voice really it starts to inspire what becomes the Reformation. And his writings, his teachings inspired Martin Luther and Zwingli and Calvin. And so the time period we've been in for the last 10, 20 years has been the time period when Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses. And the thing about that was that now with the printing press, people had access to it. There was
Hmm.
all these people that now knew how to read. They were maybe second, third generation readers. And the Bible had been printed, and now everybody had access to this, and that changed the consciousness of people. Instead of feeling like that everything had to go through the Catholic Church, there was new thinking, and this is why Luther, even though Wycliffe was saying the same thing a century before, his words now could be heard, understood. And so when we got to Pluto out of bounds to the south, which is the time period we're moving into now, that is when the Reformation took place. That's when enough people got on board to be able to kick the Catholic Church out of the Holy Roman Empire. It was the time period of Henry VIII, who kicked the Catholic Church out of England. And it was the time of these movements. Again, I would call them movements at that time. Now they're religions, but Lutheranism, Calvinism, uh, and those movements were successful. There was people on board. They went and created a whole new society in a foreign land a century later. And so we see that, and then the Catholic Church had to reform. It had to go through the deeper changes that had been people had been crying for years, but they only did it once there was enough people on board. And that's what we're looking at happening. And particularly because in this cycle, we're also looking at capitalism and we're looking at the robber barons in the 1860s. And while there are certain aspects of capitalism that are principally sound, we're looking at the corruption of capitalism, which really took over in World War II when the major corporations started investing in particularly Eastern Europe and and then created kind of the conditions for World War II to happen. And now we're looking at kind of this almost capitalism on steroids, way beyond what we thought. But what happens in this time period is because capitalism has been under question during this cycle, including at the very beginning when Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital, we're looking at a collapse. We're looking at a really profound change. This doesn't continue. One, because we know it can't. And there's also a lot of economists that are already talking about it's already not working.
Hmm.
Uh, and that the balance that China has formed between communism and capitalism is a balance that's more sustainable. And just capitalism without any checks and balances doesn't work.
Hmm.
I went off on a tangent there. So,
Oh yeah, no problem. So there's a lot you were just saying there. So one thing is to step because you were going through that cycle of the Reformation and Martin Luther. i- that one in particular is really amazing because so much about the sweep of Martin Luther through the Reformation has numerous echoes with this time period. A lot of astrologers back when we had that Saturn Pluto and Capricorn conjunction noted there was a Saturn Pluto and Capricorn conjunction around when he was nailing up the 95 Theses. And it's also that whole movement, it is something to, it's hard unless you really think about it a lot and really try to put yourself there. But even if you're aware of the power of religious dogma and authority nowadays in an oppressive way, because there's certainly great things about religion and that sort of thing. But it's actually it's hard for us now to actually even be able to imagine and conceive the extent of that power that they had and how inconceivable it would have been for anyone to even imagine anything different at that time. And part of that cycle is also, you mentioned like the Medicis, and there was this whole thing of like, part of Martin Luther was like the corruption of the church was part of that problem, and people just being paying to have their sins absolved, and things that he really saw as being like corrupt. But it was not just Saturn, Pluto. As it's coming down there into that the whole peasant revolt and the Reformation and a really chaotic time that had a lot of death, but it did, like you're saying, that's the thing about these patterns. It leads ultimately, when we take a much larger stretch of historical storylines, it leads to reforms over time and change actually happening. There was a Saturn Neptune conjunction in Pisces, but it also meant Saturn Neptune was ending their cycle in Pisces like we have now. It was a Saturn Jupiter conjunction that time in Pisces, but we're in this period with like Saturn Pluto, Saturn Jupiter, Saturn Neptune. It's another replication of that particular cycle, which is of real interest to me related to this. And so when you're talking then about the current cycle we're in, one of the ideas, which I think it would be good to talk about Persephone's revolution and how Persephone and Demeter come into this.
Mm.
But one thing you point out is when we have these new ideas at division time with Pluto rising essentially from south to north to go over our celestial equator. There's these new ideas, but as it's rising up to power, these are people that tend to be connected to the empire, and an empire or some way, or power people, and it gets sort of swept up into the power. And so we see those technological inventions of Maxwell turning into atomic bombs and warfare, even though there's also some liberatory things happening. We have Darwin, who, and what's also interesting about this, coming back to now, is that this was the last time Neptune was in Aries too, was the same time period we're talking about. Um, in the early 1860s, but Darwin coming out, and we have this again completely inconceivable breaking up some old thoughts of dogma about creation and evolution, but it turns into this sort of meme or philosophy of the survival of the fittest. And that's why corporations and these powerful people should just take control. And we have all these plutocrats arising, right, with the Industrial Revolution and natural resource. And these, you mentioned the robber barons and these corporations, which is really one of the big sweeps of arcs we see in this cycle, is the end of all these monarchies and in the 19th century, and this rise of these plutocrat wealthy people that have now reached its, we thought it was bad before, but we've it's like out of, it's really so extreme right now, it's hard to even imagine how unbalanced that is with like the people that have all the money. But there's this way that reckoning that happens in this cycle, although it's again could be inconceivable now, that that type of authority and power could be broken up and something changed. This is essentially what you're seeing with the cycle, that is actually a possibility in ways that we wouldn't even be able to really fully imagine right now.
Right. Yeah, because Pluto's not quite out of bounds yet until September of 2025. Yeah, I think that inconceivableness of what's possible, what structures can be taken down, what can be changed. You brought up a number of things. Yeah, with Darwin, I think it is interesting to see the arc of his thinking, which at the beginning of this cycle was also the beginning of the psychology. It was the beginning of the self-help movement. It was the beginning
Hmm.
of sociology. It was the beginning of homeopathy, naturopathy, pharmacology. All of these things really got root in the 1860s. And that whole survival of the fittest isn't really part of his thesis. That was developed by a sociologist who, I'm forgetting his name right now, Henry somebody, but uh, yeah, took hold in terms of a belief system during World War II that we are now like much more strongly questioning, particularly since the 1980s. And I think that's not just an entirely bad thing. Our understanding of psychology and our ability to heal from trauma is a huge arc in this cycle that portends a much different reform time because we have the ability to heal from trauma in a way that has not been accessible before. And the new modalities of healing that are just really taking root in internal family systems and ancestry work and just there's breakthroughs in homeopathy happening. All of these things were started with the thoughts and the ideas that were going on in the 1860s, and now they can really kind of bear fruit in a way. Yeah.
Right. And the you had mentioned about some of the technology too. So the way
Mhm.
that comes in with Maxwell and then these
Mhm.
all the I mean computers and everything coming in. And
So
so the
here,
point we've yeah, sorry.
so, so there's a thing about Maxwell's equations
Hmm.
that it's about electricity and magnetism. And in the ramp up after he developed those through mostly Thomas Edison and the corporate powers, they focused on the part of those equations that has to do with electricity and generating electricity because electricity could be monitored, you could charge for it, it could be told. But magnetism, which is actually a more powerful aspect of those equations, couldn't be. Um, you can't make money off of magnetism because magnetism is just an eternal source that comes through the earth, whereas electricity needs to be generated. And so when we get to World War II, we see kind of the explosion of that generation of the generative aspect of energy. But within those equations are the more receptive aspects of energy. And people have been working on this back to Tesla, the actual Nikola Tesla, who was developing free energy based on understanding magnetism. These breakthroughs in technology, they've already happened. There's already people that have worked out free energy devices. They've just been suppressed, oppressed. As Pluto gets out of bounds, these things could come out. And we're already looking at peak oil, like, and all these kind of last kind of embers of war that are happening around oil, Ukraine. And it's all about kind of gasping for the last drops of this resource that was
Hmm.
discovered in the 1860s. Like oil from the earth was sure they knew it like it was abundance in the fields in Russia for years, but nobody had anything to, any reason to do with it. They didn't have any reason for it until they started using oil lamps and then started using it for electricity and generating energy for trains and then automobiles and then planes, all developed in the early parts of this cycle.
Hmm.
So now we're looking at a complete energy revolution that's about to happen. And
Hmm.
I, and yeah, there may be blackouts and times where the grid goes down and infrastructure collapse, but these abilities to use magnetism for energy, these are already in existence. And it could even be that AI taxes the whole system so much that that's part of the contributing factor to it crumbling.
Hmm. And so it's also really interesting that Neptune coming back into Aries is like coming full circle. Like I think
Yeah,
Neptune was
let's
in
talk.
Aries when Maxwell did that.
You're bringing up Neptune and Aries, so
Yeah.
let's bring that in. So, first of all, Neptune and Pluto have an exact 3-2 relationship. It's
Hmm.
incredibly precise. So Neptune goes around the sun 3 times, Pluto goes around the sun 2 times. And it happens that when Neptune goes into Aries, it always coincides with Pluto being at either 0 degrees declination at the vision time, or Pluto in extreme out of bounds, or north, or Pluto at extremes out of bounds south. Because of Pluto's elliptical orb, it skips over the justice point. But every single time Neptune's in Aries, so each time Neptune's in Aries, it's correlating with a different phase in the Pluto cycle. And I think that's important to bring out.
Hmm.
Neptune's 165-year cycle. So we've seen a bunch of those, many more of those in the last 4,000 years. And there's and because it's this exact 3-2 relationship, it means that it even goes in order. that that Neptune's in Aries at the vision point, then the power point, then the reform point. And so we even can draw a bigger cycle, whereas the last time Pluto was out of bounds to the south was the Revolutionary War, was the late 1700s. Um, and then the time before that was the Reformation. And in that time period was when Neptune was in Aries. And so the last time Neptune was in Aries and Pluto was out of bounds to the south was the Reformation. So that is the clearest indication of what we're about to move into. Uranus is approximately 2 times around the sun for Neptune's every 1 time. So that also fits into this, although it's not precise enough to track it back thousands of years and have that kind of precision. But over the last several hundred years, it's been Uranus has been in Gemini as or close to there, as Neptune is at 0 degrees Aries, as Pluto is at the vision point or out of bounds.
So that
Bad.
Uranus and Gemini and Neptune in Aries combination tends to show up at the vision, but this time we're gonna have it coming in during the reform.
It's any of them
Oh,
because
okay, it can be any of them.
it's whatever Neptune's doing.
Mm,
And I think the interesting thing about Uranus in Gemini, particularly since it's so precise this time, is that 0 degrees Gemini is where the Pleiades are. And we know the
yeah.
Pleiades are cool, right? So there's something about Uranus bringing in the awakening from the Pleiades.
Mm,
And Neptune at 0 degrees Aries, it's not just important for it being the beginning of the cycle, but that's called the Aries point, which is our connection to the world, our ability
mhm.
to feel connected to the world. So I think one of the things that we're also looking at with all of this Pisces work, which Pisces kind of brings in our deeper spiritual work, but it's I think an end to loneliness, which I think is the kind of deeper pandemic that's happening in the United States, is people feeling isolated and lonely.
Mhm.
And I think there's kind of some radical shifts as Neptune gets into Aries, which is 2025 this year to begin with. It won't be completely in Aries until 2026. And then it will be in Aries for,
Like 2039 off and on. Yeah.
so it will be in Aries for this entire Pluto out of
Yep.
bounds.
The entire time.
And Uranus will be in Gemini for most of this time period also, which means it's going to be crossing a lot of stars in Orion's belt. That brings in kind of a rectification of the whole belief system of hunter-prey that's deep in humanity. So I think in addition to Pluto being out of bounds to the south, being the last time out of bounds, which is the last revolution, the revolution to end all revolutions. And I think Uranus is part of helping us wake up to the perspectives we've had that have contributed to so much violence on the planet. And then we have Neptune allowing us to create something new.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to think of, so I mean, one of the things about all of that that's really important, just to reiterate some of what you were just saying, is we see a bunch of repeating. So I'm realizing we never you mentioned it in all of that, but one thing if people are just wondering what was the last time Pluto in Aquarius, when Pluto was out of bounds in this reform period. It was the American Revolution, and that was people. It's very well known. That was also Uranus and Gemini were very famous for those lining up at that American Revolution. But when we're looking at the way this also will line up with Neptune and Aries, um, the Neptune and Aries, and with this reform, what goes back to the Reformation, which definitely had that whole arc of the printing press coming in, being part of accelerating that. So when we come back to this cycle now, and we have this vision, we have Maxwell with the magnetism. I mean, we did have, as we came into that, there was a Neptune and Aries, Uranus and Gemini, but it was Pluto at the vision point. And so one of the things you've shown is that vision point goes out of balance in power and abuse to the north, but it often will cycle back around for meaningful change to come in then when we hit the reform, which is what we're doing, which yeah, goes with all this technology. So the justice period is the one that we've not talked as much about. So that's coming down from power across.
Mhm.
That was in the late 80s, and it lined up pretty well with the last Saturn and Neptune conjunction, which is also interesting. So a lot of people are talking about the Saturn Neptune conjunction, and which again, because you're saying about the Aries point, it's completely wild. It's at zero Aries. But that last one, people talk like, oh, the Berlin Wall came down, and we had the singing revolutions, and we had the Velvet Revolution, and the Soviet Union collapsed. And I think, especially with your book, the one that was really relevant is Tiananmen Square, where there is this amazing awakening and revolution that is then crushed. And that's like the cry for justice that you're speaking of. So it's important to realize that the change that came in with that last Saturn and Neptune, all very powerful, was at this justice point. And the previous Saturn Neptune, also powerful, but that was at this time of power, abuse of power. So
Mhm.
this Saturn Neptune is very different. And is there anything more? Oh, actually, you know what might be helpful here? I keep wanting to bring in Persephone and Demeter. So could you tell us why your book's called Persephone's Revolution, and then
Mhm.
how you connect Persephone and Demeter and Pluto? Maybe let's just use this current cycle that we're in. You could start with the vision in that early 1860s.
Mhm.
Would you like to do that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I interwove the myth of Persephone because it fits the narrative and helps us digest what this cycle
Yeah.
is. So the myth of Persephone, and it's a Greek myth, and I begin with Persephone being born and Hades, who is Pluto is the Roman name for Hades, the Greek name. Um, and Persephone is a Greek name. So the Persephone is born, and Hades is given the keys to the kingdom of the underworld. And at the power time, it's when Pluto or Hades abducts Persephone. And the abduction, and I think of that as what happens when Pluto goes out of bounds to the north. There's an abduction. Genghis Khan abducted, massive, Augustus Caesar abducted, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, they abducted. There was a massive abduction where people are so afraid. They're taken unawares. And most of us on the planet right now did not live through World War II. We don't know what it was like. We don't know the fear levels that get incited when Pluto's out of bounds to the north. And that's that abduction of Persephone. At the Justice time period is after she's abducted, Demeter, her mother, goes into massive grief. And at first, she's just wandering around lost, which is what typically happens after the power time. In our current cycle, there was, the 1950s, 60s, people are just like, what? Um, and so Demeter's grieving. At the justice point is when Demeter starts to find her power. Like she's like, I'm going to intercede, and she creates it so that the the earth doesn't have is in just eternal winter. And she starts the most massive boycott ever, right? Just like I'm
Yes, first labor strike.
yeah.
Your archetypal labor strike, yeah.
Yeah, and she's and so it's an intercession and she's begging Zeus to get her daughter, which is also his daughter, back
Mhm.
from the underworld, which um I guess without the people living, then there's nobody to worship Zeus, and he's like, okay, I'll do it. And at the reform time is the transformation of Persephone being brought out from the underworld by Mercury. Hermes goes down and gets her. And at the same time, she eats the seeds, which has her connected to the underworld for all time. And this transformation that happens in her, as well as in her mother, as well as in Hades, as well, like all of them are transformed by this experience. And she continues to rule the underworld. And in all the myths, or most of the myths, after that point, when Persephone is ruler of the underworld, she is a ruler with compassion, with mercy. She shows mercy to a bunch of the different people who wind up there. She steps into equal power with Hades. So there's something about the feminine rising. Not that that's happened much in past cycles. But we can see a lot of powerful female leaders at the reform time. Catherine the
Yeah,
Great,
you made a
absolutely.
good, yeah, you definitely show that in your book, yeah.
And so I think of Persephone as being all of us now, and as the people, as a movement of that rising. It's the choice to do the deep work, which is what she chose. I think Persephone's journey, which doesn't she's the title of the myth, but I think even when you read the myths, she's a very minor role in her own story. And in my book, I try and make her more of the center point of her own story, because her mother takes front and center, and her father takes front and center, and Hades takes front and center. But really, the deep work is that she somehow transforms while she's abducted, while she's in the underworld, she's fasting to choose her life direction. And it's clear that she's chosen her life because of how she lives it as she goes on as a wife or partner to Hades. And it's less about their marriage and more about them in terms of the power that they have and how that further supports what happens in humanity and what happens in the heavens.
Yeah, she certainly steps into being the queen of the underworld. And really, at that point, she is the goddess of the underworld and really is more powerful. I mean, really,
Yes,
more
she's
powerful than
more
Pluto, or
powerful.
more than Pluto than Hades. Yeah, I love that what's also an amazing synchronicity about all this and how long it's taken for your book to finally get published and about to be able to do this interview is that I, in the past period of time, actually was able to go to Greece and go to Eleusis or Elefsina and be at the site of the mysteries and just experience the land and the space there. And I do think, from my experience there, what I was able to pick up was because one of the things that's also really important, you do mention in your book, but to bring this into is the mysteries, because Demeter is, of course, the goddess of the earth and fruit and abundance and fertility and life, but as this principle of death and the eternal creation, eternal recurrence of the soul and life. And through any night or dark night, the sun will rise, like the seed will regenerate. We'll go through this passage of death and this birth. And perhaps it was a more ancient site of perhaps originally more about just like that corn coming, the regeneration of nature and fertility and life. But it definitely gets turned into at a point also about the soul. And I've felt this palpable sense still there of the mysteries being about overcoming fear and not having any sense of that fear dissolving in whatever way the mysteries would put us in touch with, whether that's a cosmic mind or some kind of eternal sense of our soul. Even to the point of like thinking we're talking a lot about the transits here, but even like that's kind of all meaningless, honestly, when you're getting to that kind of level of being or experience. And interestingly, even those mysteries, the Roman Empire is all over that site at a certain point. The emperors are all coming there. They're wanting to get in this. It turns into this huge
Mm.
power thing, even that side of the mysteries. But I think that's a really powerful idea because it would be in this arc. So you're seeing how this vision time, which would be the 1860s with Darwin, Maxwell, homeopathy,
Mhm.
psychology, also the robber barons, though, and these plutocrats rising in power. That is then the abduction of Persephone, World War II era. When we come down to that cry of justice, which is the descent, that is Demeter grieving and as part of that story, demanding that they build her the temple, and she then gives humanity the mysteries. And by also giving humanity the mysteries, there is a sense there, I think, of the overcoming of the fear that I think sweeps us into that reform,
That's beautiful.
where people are no longer so afraid. Because you were talking about, Pluto out of bound north, like people just either go along with it or they're too afraid to do anything.
Yeah.
And there is this sense of, and interestingly, there's a real more and more scholarship, honestly. This is also interesting, leading into this time period now, coming into this final reform, more and more scholarship and interest in the mysteries and a lot of this more ancient thought, I feel like is also all really building and coming in right now too. And certainly the best aspects of depth psychology and working all these types of things, it all kind of sort of folds together in many ways.
Yeah, that's beautiful. The way of looking and um, working with fear that comes in at that justice time period. I think that the falling apart of the Soviet Union was so significant right
Hmm.
in that justice time period. I think about the people in those regions that have had that experience of their empire falling. And I think they're a little bit more ready for the reform time. I think there'll be big uprisings in Russia, or the Russian leaders will figure out they have to change. And in some ways, we're already seeing them catch that. I mean, first they have to like completely decimate Ukraine, but once Putin and whoever else he's with up there, that the coalition that's forming with China and the BRICS nations is creating, I think, a different kind of global society than what was created post World War II. And the fear piece is, I think, throughout the last 40 years, uh, we've seen demonstrations, we've seen big movements, and we've also seen people risk their lives to get us information. We've seen Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, whatever you think about them personally, it took a great deal of courage for them to
Hmm.
do that, and they've suffered
Edward Snowden also.
with Snowden, and then Greta Thunberg and
Hmm.
Malala Yousafzai.
Hmm.
Please get her
I
name right.
can't say her name right either, but yes.
And even what we're seeing in Syria now with al-Jilani kind of actually, whether he follows through on what he's hoping to create with HTS, but he's saying things out loud about freedom and love and unity. And just the voicing of that and the courage to voice these things in a world that so values corruption and greed. I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage. And I think this is a little bit of the beauty of this election and all of these elections that are going on and these regime changes that are happening is I think they're going to embolden people. And people are ready to be like, okay, this has gotten so bad that now it's really up to us. And I think that message of it's up to us, we can't kind of rely on the powers that be anymore. We're not in a secure system that's going to protect us and take care of us. I think we'll see that really rising throughout 2025. And
Hmm.
right now, it's actually kind of good that it's not happening as Mars is retrograde, because I think Mars would just, it's just going to incite volatility. Whereas when we get to the Venus retrograde in March, I'm super excited about that because that's also crossing over the Aries point. It's during eclipses. I think there's the new insights are really coming about. And then we have the summer to move forward, and then the fall is when Pluto goes out of bounds, and that's when the real
Right.
uprisings are happening.
Right. So that's important. Let's emphasize that again. So it'll be this, is it this September or August that Pluto goes out of bounds for the first time?
September 11th,
Oh, wow. Okay.
easy date to remember.
September. So and does that stretch into December or
No,
November this time?
it just goes till through August, through October, I'm sorry.
Oh, just through October. Okay. So it's just a real short one this first year.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, but it will be starting to happen this year. That's the important piece.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. The one of the things that you did mention in your book that I thought was really great, which I know we don't have time to go into all of this right now or anything like that, but you did mention you not only go through these big periods of history, you then also do talk about this current cycle that we're mentioning, and then you also focus it even on different regions, and you do emphasize, for example, like you were just saying, how Russia, especially since they have Russian people still have this, and that whole area, I mean, Eastern, you're all around there. They all have this memory of that last Saturn Neptune conjunction and the revolution and dissolution, and how much things can really change. That is a place to really watch. China, even though that would seem completely inconceivable right now with the amount of state control and power, something could change there, or perhaps the leaders to avoid that happening could institute some reforms and changes and alliances that we are not really aware of now either. And so that's something that you definitely go through in the book that I think is also really helpful. And then you also talk about that there's climate change, which is relevant for Demeter and the gods of that's another factor. Whatever side you're on of believing of what's going on in the climate change, it's undeniably happening, and we are getting these much massive storms, like we just had that one in the Asheville devastation with. There could be other things happening like that. That's a huge factor that could be coming into play. And we don't have to go through all of the stuff that you laid out, but you did lay out some different potential scenarios of what could happen, which is really helpful about your book that you also then you don't just do the historical research, you then talk about well, what could happen now. And then you also even have some ideas about guidance that we could perhaps bring into our lives as we're living them through this time period. But yeah, is there anything about the potential, a little bit more about the potential things that could happen you'd like to share?
Yeah, I separated it into five different possibilities based on different things that have happened in the past. So one is collapse, which has happened. I particularly focus on one that the major Bronze Age collapse in 1177 BCE, which focused on the Middle East, which the Middle East is kind of following that path. But that's like when you have infrastructure decay, major cities at that time period, 1177 BC was uh, there were major empires. They all had trade agreements. It was a very similar world to now without our kind of technology. And all of a sudden, it all changed kind of in a decade, right when Pluto was out of bounds to the south. But what it changed into was it's not like all the people died. It changed into more tribal states. And that was the beginning of Judaism being able to become a nation right in the wake of that. And so we see, I think the collapse of things in the Middle East, but also people being able to coexist in tribal states that are peaceful. I don't think this has to be, if they find ways to eat and sleep and have water, then they can create societies and smaller societies. And I think maybe this will happen in the US also, that we have the infrastructure for that, the breaking apart of the empire into smaller tribal states. And I think historically, you have to do really deep research to find out about this because smaller tribal states aren't necessarily what historians have focused on. They're more focused on the wars and battles, and tons of books on the battles, but when people are peaceful, there's just less written about them.
Hmm.
And so that's one. Another option is Revolutionary War, which is what we saw in the prior cycle, which
Hmm.
was 1775 to 1796. We saw the French and the American revolutions in that time period. So we see uprisings. There's lots of historical. There was a Jewish revolt in 70. There was the Boudica revolt. There was lots of revolutions. Even the Reformation was a revolution in Switzerland at the time. Zwingli was killed. So we see there being violence of an uprising. Uh, then there's also benevolent leaders step in, particularly in association with massive demonstrations. We see peaceful, nonviolent demonstrations. One of the beautiful things about this current cycle is that nonviolent demonstrations have been part of the entire cycle, starting from
Hmm.
Tolstoy and Ramakrishna to
Hmm.
Gandhi, who was fasting and doing his deepest, freedom for India during World War II. So, in addition to atomic bombs and World War, there was Gandhi fasting. For whatever you think of him, he was doing this work of nonviolent demonstration. And then massive nonviolent demonstrations at the Justice time period when the singing revolution in Estonia and Lithuania and
Hmm.
Latvia, like we have the Velvet Revolution, we have a lot of examples of peaceful revolutions. And so this is where there's peaceful revolutions and then there's more enlightened leaders step in. A fourth is a massive scientific paradigm shift
Hmm.
where, we have a whole new way of working with science or what we understand to be true, even. And that can come in again with the prior cycle, looking at the Industrial Revolution. That cycle began with Galileo and Kepler. It moved into the power time when it was Newton who was in charge of the mint and developing the Royal Society and Boyle's laws. All of those laws, kind of similar to the printing press, similar to the computers, they were developing a system of understanding nature and and particularly with the focus on conquering nature, particularly in the focus of controlling nature, which then eventually really took place at the reform time in the late 1700s, where we have the cotton gin and the steam engine. And even though the steam engine was first developed during that power time, during the time of Newton, it wasn't useful. They couldn't use it. It wasn't practical until it got to the steam engine that was developed in the 1700s. So
And was
um,
that the steam engine? Is that reform, the steam
reform,
engine?
yes.
Reform, okay.
So Newcomen developed a prototype of it during the power time, but it wasn't until the reform time. Everyone's going to know who did this, but I can't. Do you remember who did it? Why am I thinking Fulton, but it wasn't Fulton?
For which one was it? You said?
Who's usually credited with the steam engine? The one we learn about when we're kids.
I don't remember either. Sorry.
Guy, we all know his name. We learned
Yeah, yeah.
him. He was the 1700s guy.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. Just so, I know you have another one, but just the ones you have gone over are really interesting because we do see with the idea of collapse. I mean, Middle East. So I know you mentioned in your book we could perhaps see a two-state solution ultimately emerge with what's going on in Israel and Gaza, even though that might be hard to believe right now, but very well that could happen. And in contrast to a lot of people talk about, oh, the Civil War is going to happen in the United States, rather than like a replication of like states going to war with each other, you talk about more a potential fragmentation and certain states claiming greater rights to take over certain issues that creates some kind of shifting that maybe then something else, there's a little chaos fragmentation there that something else emerges. Would that be kind of accurate with
Yeah.
that one? Yeah.
Yeah, because I think so. I brought up two-state solution because that's what exactly what happened in the reform time
Mm,
of the nation of Judea when
mm,
King David, he was the one who rose into power during the power time, and it was Solomon during the justice time period. Solomon dies, and his sons split up the country into Judea and Israel.
mm.
But I think what's probably more accurate is a multi-state solution that's happening there.
Multi-state.
And I
Mm,
think that's what, and this is where maybe there's a little more hope that I had even 10 years ago for China because Xi is talking about multipolar, instead of one massive unified thing that was created during World War II, where we had the IMF and the World Bank and these powerful institutions coming into
mm-hmm,
multiple states in the United States, multiple states in the Middle.
mm-hmm.
I think that's likely based on what's happened in the past.
Yeah, that's all very interesting. And then also as part of this and nonviolent protests and change, which could lead to they're nowhere seemingly to be seen right now, but benevolent leaders could emerge at some point. More, I mean, there certainly are people that are leaders that are benevolent in the world, but as far as claiming greater power and getting something with real traction, I guess, would be the way to perhaps talk about it with more agency and effective change happening. And then the science revolution you were mentioning, I think is really fascinating in terms of Maxwell and and that's something I have wondered with the Neptune just in Aries, but the Saturn Neptune in Aries at the zero Aries point. I've really wondered about that and Neptune Aries being the exaltation of the sun and it's like this power source. And for something, there's a track record of this with Saturn Neptune anyway, outside of even everything you're talking about here of total inconceivable change in the way people think. And this Pluto cycle you're talking about has gone also with stuff like the heliocentric revolution, and that's completely changing our
So,
mind frame on this. So something could really come in with that we don't even know right now, right?
so I think you're bringing in the Saturn transits.
Mm,
So when we think about Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, they're all invisible. So Saturn is a dim planet, but it does bring in the connection to what we know and recognize. And so when you also look at all of these transits, Neptune into Aries, Uranus into Gemini, Pluto at a bounds or at 0 degrees declination, there's Saturn triggers to it. And you've been bringing in the Saturn triggers throughout the talk. Saturn brings it into our reality.
hmm
And so I think it is really significant that Saturn is going to conjunct Neptune at 0 degrees Aries because it's going to bring the new idea um, into our consciousness, into our actual physical reality. I think that the benevolent ruler piece is the major precedent for all the past cycles. That's happened every single time, but that's because we've lived in a more patriarchal world that has been hierarchically structured. And my fifth option is something that hasn't happened before because why not? Why does it have to all be based on the past? And this is about an awakening moment. We have 7 billion people on the planet. That's never happened before. There's not, we have the ability to communicate with each other instantly. That's never happened before. And we have a moment when all of every country is in major crisis at this moment, which has also never happened before. And we have these transits where Saturn at 0 degrees Aries, which it's not there yet. It's not even really close yet. So but it's going to be really there in the spring, right in May, but right after Neptune gets into Aries, which Neptune does that the day after an eclipse, right? There's so much
Hmm.
synchronicity around that March, April, May time period that the new thing that's here that's about an awakening. So this fifth piece is about an awakening. It's about a
Hmm.
global consciousness awakening. And in that, we don't need benevolent leaders.
Right. That's a good point.
In that, there aren't going to be leaders because it's going to be the collective having a consciousness that's multidimensional, understanding things at a bigger place where we don't need to have somebody else telling us what to do or showing us the way or even pretending they're showing us the way.
Well,
Uh,
that's what's really fascinating is when we think about if you just take it back to maybe starting with that Renaissance, because since the Renaissance, we had the Renaissance, the Reformation, which then led into everything that British Empire and then the American Revolution, which then leads into the one we have now, essentially. And so if you think about the Renaissance one, the power of the church and the papal, I mean, this is like divine authority. This was God. This was absolute authority that was still overturned. And we then still have this monarchy system, and all these monarchs were imagined to be divine. They claim this divine right. They are divinities also toppled, completely overturned. Now the people that claim power are these plutocrats, people with money that actually nobody believes has any power. Nobody thinks they're divine. No, it's beyond even the emperor has no clothes. They really have nothing except they've taken all this power and control. So there's actually much less. There's not as much of a step collectively to overturn this, really. If you think of, I think is why you're going with, yeah, that awakening
mhm.
possibility, really.
Yeah, and we can look at all of the Pluto cycles back to 1800 in a succession of help.
1800 BC, you mean?
1800 BC, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
back to 1800 BC, where each cycle is about a certain stage in the evolution of humanity and
Hmm.
in particularly in our consciousness and that. I was also thinking the beginning, yeah, the end of the monarchy throughout this time period, but also at the beginning of this time period, the Pope in the 1860s, there was not just civil war in the U.S., which was part of the beginning of the cycle, but there was also civil war in Italy and civil war in Germany. And the civil war in Italy created a separate state, the Vatican City, from the rest of the country, and the country kind of separated from the Pope at that beginning. And the Pope then declared himself infallible, which it's almost like ironic that the Pope declares himself infallible after we've already been so clear that they're fallible, do you know? Um, so all of these things, and I think this is a little bit why this word civil war is resonating with people because the beginning of this cycle is the seed, but it's not that we've already done the civil war thing. And but we may see kind of an effect from that. In other words, I mean, we already are because in the United States, we're seeing the boundary lines being drawn that are the
Hmm.
same as the Civil War time.
Right. And certainly civil unrest will be extreme.
Yeah.
Is there anything else about the other thing? Is there, I know you had mentioned some strategies for people and guidance.
Mhm.
Is there anything about any of that you'd like to offer
Well,
as ways to cope with the period coming up? Yeah.
I feel like I'm saying the same thing that so many other people are saying.
Yeah. That's
Know
so
your neighbors, get to know, where your resources are, where your
right.
walls. Do your meditation or whatever practices that you're here to do. But I think it's a little bit, my first one in the book is to celebrate. And I think there's a piece about being able to bring joy into
Mm,
this and share that joy and
yeah.
share the ability to play. And because I think this is going to contribute to the society that we're creating that's different.
I love that you had that because actually I did a talk on Saturn Neptune. I was researching that, and that was one of the things that I really felt before seeing that in your book that just Saturn Neptune alone is something that you need to really do that. So I think it's kind of obvious, but it's actually really important to emphasize that. Yeah, to actually intentionally do it, like actually really, yeah, make sure you're doing that.
I think art and music, I think a lot of people are scared that that's going to go by the wayside, but I think the opposite. I
Yeah.
think the major renaissance of brilliant art. I think it's interesting that Neptune's moving into Aries at 0 degrees Aries. And there's an eclipse, and Venus is retrograde. And Venus retrograde is like, let's bring on the creative time. And
Mm, yeah,
so
makes a lot of sense.
I think we're learning how to love each other in a deeper way. I think it's a good time to do your healing work, particularly now with Mars retrograde. It's just like help clear out. And I think look at where your security is attached to. Uh, Ultimately, we have to come to a sense of security that's within. And I think we have, particularly in the United States, where we have lived so comfortably, where we haven't had any wars, where, the rest of the world has pretty much seen devastation, wars, and we haven't. So there's this comfortableness. And I think there's that comfortableness has led to people tying their security to the systems, whether it's
Hmm.
or thinking that the markets are going to stay the same. And
Hmm.
I think, and I'm suggesting gradual baby steps, like just do it so that your nervous system can handle it. So if it's time to divest from certain corporations, what's your next step? What's the next thing for you to divest from? And how do you pull out of it? And noticing when you're too stressed out about it, um, but moving in that direction. I think I pay attention to my food sources. We live
Hmm.
in Olympia, which is amazing because we have so many farmers and so much local produce.
Hmm.
But I think this is in the last couple of years included, but it's a really important time to support your farmers because if
Hmm.
they're going under in your region, that's going to be difficult for you once you really need them. So supporting them before you need them. Uh, Go to your farmer's market.
That's something also in your book. I'm remembering you mentioned this a lot with some of the cycles, how it's often the farmers that get really have been put down to the industrialists in these recent cycles. Yeah, so that becomes even more important right now.
Yeah, I think the people who do well when things fall apart are people who have a little more resiliency to them,
Hmm.
who are willing to collaborate and work together.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. But great. This I think we've done a good job of covering a lot of the main messages in your book. There's actually so much more involved in your book though, tracking all these cycles. Is where can people purchase your book?
So I'd love it for you to buy it directly from the publisher, which is Revelor Press. And it's just
Also located in Olympia.
yes. But it is available now on Amazon. And I'll be getting it into a few bookstores. But my website is rosiefinn.com. So you could just go to my website and all the links are there for
Great.
it. And you could also sign up for my Substack. So go to my website, rosiefinn.com, and you can find everything, all the links into classes and other things that I'm doing.
Yeah, do you have any classes or events coming up in the near
No,
future? Just taking it easy right now. Yeah. Celebrating your book.
I will though. I'll have some workshops. I want to be doing small workshops that are supporting people in finding their calling in
Hmm.
to Persephone's revolution.
Yeah. And so if they go to your website, they can't buy the book directly from your website, but they could go to, if they want to buy it directly from Revelor Press and Olympia, they can do that. if they'd
I
rather
hope,
not, if they'd rather divest from Amazon and
yeah.
not do that. Yeah.
Yes. If you go to my website, there's a link. It'll take you right to the page to buy it. So it's just one extra step, but it's just a click. And
Yeah.
you can get it from there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Rosie. This has
Thank you so
been,
much, Trey. This is fabulous. And blessings on your unfolding work here as you do more interviews. And yeah,
yeah. Yeah,
thank you.
thank you.
Thanks for supporting my work all these years too.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, thank you. I wouldn't be where I am now with astrology without you. So appreciate all the time you spent with me in the past in classes and things like that, which was great. It's very different now. People learn so much online, but it was great. I got to, yeah, learn from you in person around here. So that was, thank you.
Thanks.
So I guess if you're watching this, definitely check out Rosie's site and you can go there to purchase her book, Persephone's Revolution, which is I would say it's an absolute must read right now if you are in any way interested in anything happening with astrology over the course of the next decade. So thank you, Rosie, for being here with us.
Thank you.
And speaking of the great collective changes coming with the astrology of 2025 and the ensuing decade, with Pluto also going out of bounds in southern declination, I will be sharing a webinar about the transit of Neptune in Aries called Through the Looking Glass with Neptune in Aries. This will be on Sunday, January 19th at 10 a.m. I will be going into the meaning of the upcoming transit of Neptune in Aries, which begins on March 30th. And as part of that, I will be looking back at past historical examples of Neptune in Aries, and I will be referencing Rosie's book and weaving in some of the additional meaning that we talked about some in this interview of how Neptune in Aries lines up with the vision and reform periods of Pluto in Aquarius, among many other things that I'll be talking about related to Neptune and Aries. I'll also be talking about the upcoming Saturn and Neptune conjunction in the first degree of Aries, and I will be talking about the past historical examples and meaning that we can find with Saturn and Neptune conjunctions. If you're not able to make it to this webinar live in person, I will be recording it and sharing it with everybody. I'll put a link to how to purchase a ticket for this webinar in the description of this video. I hope you'll join me on Sunday, January 19th to explore the meaning of Neptune in Aries.